Neville Goddard framed the idea expressed in the title. God said, "Don't ask again. Just receive," as a statement about the psychology of assumption. In his view, to ask repeatedly is not simply to request. It is to occupy a mental position. That presupposes absence. To receive, by contrast, is to occupy a mental position that presupposes presence. The difference is not in outer behavior, but in inner identification. He treated this as a structural feature of consciousness, rather than as a moral instruction. The mind, he argued, does not respond to verbal petitions. It responds to the state that is felt as already established. In this framework, asking and receiving are not actions directed outward. They are positions taken within awareness. The central claim is therefore precise. Consciousness organizes experience according to what it accepts as real, not according to what it verbally requests. The assumption behind this claim is that consciousness is the primary field of causation. For Neville, events are not produced first in the external world and then mirrored internally. The order is reversed. Inner states are primary, and what appears as circumstance is secondary. This does not mean that physical processes are denied, but that their significance and patterning are said to be structured by the state of awareness through which they are perceived and enacted. To receive only has meaning if consciousness is treated as the place where outcomes are first formed in principle. You are asked, within this model, to consider what it would mean if experience were organized by internal identification, rather than by external sequence. The coherence of the system depends on this single assumption, that awareness is not a passive observer, but an active field in which possibilities are selected and stabilized. The psychological mechanism Neville describes centers on imagination and feeling, not as fantasy or emotion, but as modes of cognitive identification. Imagination, in his usage, is the mind's capacity to occupy a state as present. Feeling is the sense of reality that accompanies such occupation. When a state is merely thought about, it remains external to the self. When it is felt as real, it is taken into the structure of identity. In this view, asking corresponds to imagining from the position of absence, while receiving corresponds to imagining from the position of fulfillment. You are not encouraged to create images or emotional excitement, but to notice how the mind distinguishes between what it considers hypothetical and what it considers established. The mechanism is simple. Whatever is internally accepted as fact becomes the reference point from which perception and action proceed. Discipline of attention plays a central role in maintaining or altering this reference point. Neville did not describe discipline as forceful suppression of unwanted thoughts, but as the consistent return of awareness to a chosen assumption. Inner speech, in particular, was seen as the primary medium through which states are reinforced. Repetition of statements of lack sustains identification with not having. Repetition of statements that imply completion sustains identification with having. You are asked to observe how attention naturally gravitates toward familiar inner narratives, and how these narratives stabilize a sense of self. Within the model, discipline means allowing only those inner statements that are consistent with the assumed state, not as an act of willful control, but as an alignment of attention with a selected identity. The internal logic of causation in Neville's framework follows from these points. If states of consciousness are primary, then perception, interpretation, and behavior are organized by the state currently occupied. Circumstances are not treated as independent causes, but as expressions that correspond to the dominant assumption. This does not require a denial of physical law. It requires a reordering of explanatory priority. The state determines what is noticed, what is interpreted as significant, and what actions appear natural or necessary. You can observe in ordinary experience that two individuals in different states respond differently to the same situation. Neville extends this observation into a general principle. The state is the cause, the event is the effect. The coherence of the model lies in this consistent sequencing. Historically, similar inner first models appear across many traditions, though expressed in different languages. Philosophical schools that emphasize the formative role of belief, expectation, or conviction, and religious systems that treated faith as present certainty rather than future hope, all share a structural resemblance to Neville's position. What distinguishes his presentation is the explicit psychological framing. He did not argue for adherence to doctrine, but for examination of how identification precedes experience. The posture of already fulfilled has appeared repeatedly. As a way of describing certainty, Neville translated this posture into the language of assumption and state, removing it from ritual context and placing it in cognitive terms. The continuity suggests a recurring human attempt to understand how inner orientation shapes outer life. Perception, in this framework, is never neutral. It is filtered through the assumed identity. What you take yourself to be determines what you register as relevant, what you interpret as confirmation, and what you overlook. Receiving inwardly does not mean ignoring external conditions. It means that those conditions are interpreted through a settled expectation rather than through doubt. The model proposes that perception is organized around internal reference points. You can notice this in how the same information can appear threatening or reassuring depending on prior assumption. Neville's system extends this everyday observation into a general account of how reality is cognitively structured. Agency, accordingly, is redefined. It is not primarily the capacity to exert effort upon the world, but the capacity to select and inhabit a state of consciousness. Responsibility, in this view, lies in the maintenance of identification rather than in the management of external variables. Action is not eliminated. It is seen as the natural expression of the state one occupies. When the state changes, the pattern of action changes without the need for coercion. You are invited, within this model, to consider agency as alignment rather than as force. The question is not what to do, but from what position of identity action arises. The instruction, do not ask again, thus functions as a form of cognitive finality. It signals the end of provisional orientation and the adoption of settled assumption. It is not a command to remain passive, but an indication that the inner position has shifted from uncertainty to acceptance. To ask again would be to re-enter the posture of absence. To refrain from asking is to remain in the posture of having. The phrase marks a stopping point in inner dialogue, a cessation of the oscillation between wanting and doubting. Whether the mind can rest in such finality without seeking reassurance is an open question that the model itself leaves unresolved. Cognitive stillness, in Neville's framework, is not an altered state or a heightened experience. It is the quiet consistency of identification. When the state is accepted as real, inner argument subsides because there is no longer a question being posed. Understanding this system does not require assent to its truth, only recognition of its structure. It presents a closed explanatory loop. Consciousness as cause, assumption as mechanism, perception as effect, and stillness as the absence of internal contradiction. To see the model clearly is to see how each element supports the others. Whether one accepts its premises or not, the coherence lies in the way it accounts for the relation between inner orientation and experienced reality, without the need for exhortation, promise, or appeal.